We're going to start with Joshua, pronouns he, him, calling in from unruly serpent acrobats. What? The made by Jesus thought experiment, why the fine-tuning argument objections are too skeptical. I don't know what that means, but we're going to find out. Joshua, you are on AXP. How are you doing today?
I am doing nothing less than fantastic. I've been listening to all your conversations over like the past hour or so. And I can just say that the energy from you all is nothing less than infectious. And I'm hoping to tap into that throughout our entire discussion today. How are you?
Good. Oh, yeah, I love that. Yeah. I'm doing great, dude. So I'm trying to understand what it says here on the call screen. What's the made by Jesus thought experiment? What are you driving at here?
I am so excited that you asked me that question. So let me give you some of the context behind this. I think the fine-tuning argument for theism is one of the best reasons to believe that God exists. However, there are a number of different objections that exist that are oftentimes discussed in these lay objections against
I've got
the
a few
fine-tuning argument.
I've got a few objections.
Yeah. Thought experiment called the Made by Jesus Thought Experiment is designed to showcase that those objections are far too skeptical because they would cause us to violate some of our natural intuitions about how to reason about the world.
Okay, so hold on a second before we get there, because I want to hear this, but you said it violates our natural intuitions. Are your natural intuitions like the best way to go about science and reason, the best way to go about discovering things about the universe is just through natural intuition?
So let me actually clarify that.
Sure.
When I say natural intuitions, I really mean our reasonable intuitions about how to reason about the world. Like, for example, the likelihood principle of Bayesian reasoning.
Right, but what I'm driving at here is that, like, when you talk about just intuition and, like, this kind of natural idea, the whole point of learning about logical fallacies is to learn to not use your natural intuition and reasoning and not to just go with what seems natural and what seems to fit into your normal way. The point of learning logic, skepticism, critical thinking, whatnot, is to break out of the trap that your own heuristics lay for you. And it sounds like what you're saying is, no, the heuristics are good and you got to stick to them and then you'll find the truth. And I just want to clarify, is that actually what you're trying to get to here before we get into this thought experiment?
That is not what I'm trying to get to here.
Okay.
By intuition, I'm referring to like a disposition to believe. So if you were to go on the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they have an excellent article on what intuitions mean in a philosophical sense.
No, philosophers don't agree on what intuition.
Philosophers
don't agree on what intuition is. I've talked to several philosophers about this, and they don't have an agreement. So that's not going to help. The SEP is going to list several different ways on how to understand that. They're not going to all agree with each other.
Let's set this aside for just a second, because I feel like this entire call could be this.
So move past it.
And we might actually come back to it depending on what your thought experiment is. So let's hear your thought experiment, and we'll stop you when it stops making sense.
That sounds excellent to me.
Okay.
So here is the Made by Jesus thought experiment. Imagine, if you will, for a moment, that we all lived in a universe where every single square inch of matter had the words "Made by Jesus Christ" encoded on every single square inch of matter, or it was also encoded everywhere in the universe in some way, shape, or form. Maybe within like the movement of planets, on like the wave functions.
I feel like I already know where this is going, and I'm going to write it down really quick. Hold on just a second. Dude, you keep going.
Okay, yeah. So basically, thought experiment is that
the
words made by Jesus are encoded throughout the universe in a variety of ways. Perhaps the most easily, like written in every single square inch of matter. And this is all required by the fundamental parameters of the laws of physics. Now, if we were to believe several of the most popular objections, in lay discussions at least, to the fine-tuning argument, we should conclude a few different things. Well, namely, that this is not evidence in favor of theism, and it's certainly not evidence in favor of Christianity. And here's why. One could be a naturalist objection, kind of like the so-called single sample objection, which is that, well, we only have one universe to compare. So we can't know what the probability of a universe that has this life, that has this made by Jesus property all over it. Another could be something like, how do we know that the laws of physics that we observe or that the fundamental parameters are not necessary? Because if they are necessary, then of course we're going to be living.
Okay,
in a
so let me jump in there on that one. Okay, yeah, because like.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, because like that's gonna matter to me is like this talk of them being necessary, because we have like few options here. We talk about it like Like presumably what you want to do, like what a lot of people want to do in fine tuning is say, hey, look, there's all of these like ways that the cosmological parameters could be such that they could permit life, and there's this really small subset, probably maybe just one of those possible worlds where life is going to be. Yeah, and so the idea is that someone like myself, who's a naturalist, you want to point out like, hey, this is this giant brute contingency in your view, and it seems like really improbable under naturalism, and a lot more probable under theism. So far, so good?
Yep, so far, so good.
Great. Now, this is a problem. So, like, when you think about this, you don't actually arrest any brute contingency that you charge me with, right? It's assuming that I take that they're contingent route, because I could just take that they're necessary, and we can discuss that. But this, I really want to make sure I do this right, because sometimes people lose me here. So you stop me if you don't understand. When we think about the space of desires that God has for worlds to create, think of all the ways that the cosmological parameters could be. They could, like, just make universes collapse in on themselves. Maybe we'd be a little bit more liberal and we say they just produce like marbles, or they just produce like Forrest Valkais all the time. There's this giant range of... There's this giant range of the way that these cosmological parameters could take place, assuming that they're not necessary, right? So on your view, if you look at like at the level of God's desires, right? God could have a desire that corresponds with any one of those worlds where it's just producing Forrest Valkais, it's just producing, universes that collapse in on themselves. But all you've really done was single out, like, you've just taken a hypothesis, but baked in an auxiliary hypothesis about what the desires of what this agent wants, which, by the way, you'll get for free. Like, I had someone I know used an example that I, altered, but like, it wouldn't be evidence if I pulled out my wallet and saw that there wasn't any money in it, and I go, oh, well, there's evidence for money stealing fairies because it desires that thing, has the ability to do it, no reason not to do it, right? That would be like a really weak way for me to construct evidence. So when we zoom out on this view, it seems like all you've done was single out one desire that corresponds to the world that's life permitting, right? And just kind of from thin cloth assess that that's God's desire. But why, like, what explains why God would choose that world rather than any of the other ones? And if you don't have some type of explanation, or you don't start adding more auxiliary hypotheses about the motivation, the characters, the character of that entity, the intentions, if you don't do this from like thin cloth stuff, it turns out you're going to have a brute contingency. You can't explain why God desires the world with life-permitting parameters rather than no world at all, or the ones with Forrest Valkais. And so what you did by pointing out, in my view, that there's this like brute contingency I should be worried about, you never really arrested it. You just brought it up on a higher level. So I'm going to ask you, why does God create a world with life-permitting constants rather than just no world at all, or a world with universes just collapsing on it?
I like the whole world.
I think that's an excellent thing to point out. There are a few different responses to it, but I think it's important just to contextualize what this means for the argument. Number one, suppose I do come up with like some ad hoc explanation, as Robin Collins would call it, to say, oh yeah, well, by definition, I'm just going to define into existence a God that wants for maybe even this very conversation to happen. And therefore, the fact that we're having a life-permitting universe and this conversation, that's evidence in favor of whatever God that I would like to argue for, right? So, what Robin Collins does is he declares this concept called probabilistic tension. Now, if it seems maybe it is very likely, depending on like the version of God that I would like to argue, that the evidence exists.
Yeah, but hold on, the version of God, that's the problem. Yeah. I know, I'm sorry, but that's the problem I have, because like, what we should do is look at this from a bare designer hypothesis. Don't add any of these attributes. That's the whole point I'm trying to say is it's not gonna be a mystery that you get this expected outcome if you bake into your hypothesis these types of like, character assessments about its desires and intentions.
Yeah, what keeps throwing me off is it sounds like the core of this, and maybe I'm misinterpreting, but it sounds like the general idea here is that if every square inch of that had made by Jesus or whatever, it would be so common and it would be so obvious and it would be so natural that we would then overlook it. And we would just be like, okay, well, this is just the way things are, when in fact, it's this signature of God or whatever like that. And we wouldn't understand it.
That's the point I'm making, yeah.
Yeah, that's what I wrote down in my prediction before you started talking. Well, like the what I'm trying to say is that like, I could very easily say that is the case, and that the standard model of quarks, leptons, and bosons, we just give them the wrong letters. And if you spell them out, it actually says made by some other God that is necessarily incompatible with Jesus. It means the same nothing. Because at the end of the day, if the idea is that we can't tell what this God is saying, and at the fundamental level, this God is trying to prove herself and we can't see what she says, then it doesn't matter because it doesn't change it. And you can sit here and say, well, maybe she's trying to communicate with us. And I'm like, what if she isn't? And what if some other God is? And it means nothing. None of it means anything. So this thought experiment is just like, yeah, that'd be crazy. What do you want for lunch? That's where we go from there. Like, that doesn't help anything.
Well, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong here, JMike, but I was sitting here thinking the whole time, like, well, like, first off, it's odd to think about every square inch of matter having this written on it. I don't know how you do that on, like, an atom or whatever.
Well, that's why I was saying, like, this with the standard model. Something's tiny.
Yeah, it's weird, right? Yeah. But okay, like, let's just put that aside, right? But, like, even if every inch of matter had made by Jesus written on it, that alone does not mean that it was made by Jesus. That's not
language
valid.
Is it in? What if we develop language based on the little markings we happen to be seeing on every square inch of matter, and it just happened to spell these words? Like, there's a million what ifs and ands and except fors and unlesses and the exact same proposition spun in a different way for a different God. Like, this thought experiment is certainly a thought experiment, but it is in no way useful or helpful, and it certainly doesn't mean that the fine-tuning objections, the very valid and reasonable objections to the bullshit fine-tuning argument, it doesn't mean that they are too skeptical. And also, I don't know what too skeptical means. And so like that, because skepticism doesn't just mean disagreeing for the sake of doing it. It means withholding belief until you have good evidence and asking good questions, even about things that you like. So like, you should be skeptical of the fine-tuning argument. It's a bad argument. And if you say, yeah, but what if the world was so fine-tuned that you wouldn't even know it's fine-tuned, then you wouldn't know it's fine-tuned, but it'd still be fine-tuned. What if anything? That's
you
not
just make your problem harder.
That's not helpful. And if anything, it makes your God more confusing, because why did she make it this way just to hide herself? What's the point? If she's trying to, like, do it, you know what I mean?
I want to.
Yeah,
sorry, Josh, you go ahead. I just want to ask you my question over again.
There are all of these different hypotheses that we could come up with, like, for what kind of a universe that God would make, right? But do you think that it would be highly unlikely for God to make a universe that is life permitting?
No. This is what I'm trying to get at, right? This is what I'm trying to get at. This is what I'm trying to single back. Stop adding any attribute, desire, character, intention to this hypothesis. Let's start at a bare designer hypothesis. It's not clear to me that the bare designer hypothesis would even design anything. It could just be a designer that goes, I could design, I'm just going to chill and smoke a God bowl and just do my thing, right? Mm-hmm. So it's not clear that you're getting any...
Why don't I just provide you very quick...
Well, hold on. Let me just, hold on. Just let me get through this. All right. This is really important to me, because I don't really care about these objections are not good. I have my objections, and I think they're fucking good, right? So I'm just going to give you those, right? So when you have, like, you start out with this, it's not a mystery to anybody that when you look into the world, the thing you're seeking to explain, the explanandum, and in your explanans, the thing you're trying to do the explanation with, too many right? When you try to take the explanans and you give an account for the explanandum, it doesn't really help that what you did is look into the world, go, hey, okay, there's conscious creatures, there's life. Okay, let me take an auxiliary hypothesis and bake that into the desire of this agent. Of course you get that outcome. It's the same reason I get the outcome that when I open my wallet and there's no money in it, I can just be like, oh, okay, well, that's what's expected, when I look into the data, that, okay, well, there might be an entity that desires to steal it, has the ability to, no reason not to. If you hold that view, of course I can come up with stuff, but what we should do instead is strip those properties that give us this weird construction of evidence and tell me, right, from the bare designer hypothesis, what expectation, do you think there's an expectation on the bare designer hypothesis that it would choose any of the worlds that I listed without adding anything else?
I do, yeah.
Okay, how do you derive that expectation?
For example, yeah, so let's just say that for the bare designer hypothesis, it is an intelligent entity that is capable of making roughly whatever.
Why?
Why are no?
Right?
Like,
Why would
you
it
just
help
added
them?
another auxiliary hypothesis, and I'm telling you to fucking stop doing that.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense that
Okay,
you
so-
would
so
get to
what do you
that.
do?
Just imagine that it's like this is what I'm saying. Like, stop adding these auxiliary hypotheses that get you the expected outcome. That's so easy when you do that. Don't do that. Like, don't go when I say that, and then you just go, "Hey, let me add my auxiliary hypothesis that it's really intelligent and all this stuff." You haven't derived from anything but thin cloth, right? Like, I'm getting kind of irritated because I've asked you like 3 times not to do that.
According to your definition.
Sorry?
So, like, what is a designer then? Like, what am I working with? Like, what is the bare design hypothesis?
Well, it can design something, and it can probably decide to not design it, though it has the capacity for design. That seems compatible.
Right.
The expectation of a designer is that it might design something and it might not design something.
Entity with the capacity to design. It doesn't mean that it necessarily does design, but again, what JMike is trying to get at is exactly what I think is the problem.
You can
with
only get this
stuff.
evidence once you add a lot of this shit
Right.
in.
You have to just bring on board all of these other assumptions.
Yep.
And you don't really have a good reason to get to those if you're just trying to say it is at its most basic a designer. You don't know that the designer is going to make things out of clay unless you just bring that on board and accept it. Which is why like the argument of like, you know, this is too skeptical doesn't really make sense because this is just bare level stuff. This is just us saying like, yeah, but how did you get to that? You walked into the room and was like, holy shit, there's a fucking unicorn outside. And we were like, well, how did you get to that, man? And you're just like, well, it's there. And we're like, well, that doesn't really. But it has a horn.
It's even worse. You go, why is the unicorn there? Well, there was something that desired the unicorn. And
Right.
I'm lifting this from like a friend, a person I've talked to online. I really like this example. They list out these 3 things, and I think it's brilliant. You have that unicorn there, and you go, well, why is it there? Well, because there's a desire for for that unicorn to be there. It has the ability to produce that unicorn, and no reason not to. And if I come, let's just use like a horse or something, right? Every time I come across a horse, now I've have this evidence for the horse making designer, right? But I didn't really do anything. All I did was add these auxiliary hypotheses about the kind of character of that entity, the what it might be, the expectation might be if I look at the world and then start, it desires that thing, has the ability to produce it.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm saying, like I've said on the show, I don't really like when people say there's no evidence for God because like maybe we should just talk about like there's good evidence versus not. I'm at the point where I don't think you can get any evidence for God. It's so trivially constructed when you just go, oh, it desires X, Y, and Z and has that ability to produce it. Voila, fucking I get the expectation out of it. It's just not, like, it isn't interesting to me. And hearing people have these conversations about this thing has kind of shifted my position on it.
Yeah, I'm going to let you, Joshua, respond to that, and then I'm going to say probably the same thing in different words, and then we're going to move on.
Yeah, so from a Bayesian standpoint, what we can say is that if I were to just build in auxiliary hypotheses, right, into my hypothesis to make it stronger such that it entails the evidence we observe, then what that will actually do is that will make the combination of the auxiliary hypothesis and like the bare hypothesis less plausible. So that wouldn't overall help the probability that I'm trying to assert anyway.
Well, I mean, I'm more of like on the frequentist side, so like maybe me and you can have a conversation. Like,
oh well, if you're into the frequentist side, then by all means,
I don't have an issue with like
ignore the
Bayes.
frequentist
There's a lot I don't understand about Bayes, you know. So,
Yeah.
but no, I would like to have a conversation with that if you would be interested in. Like, probably not on the show because
Yeah,
people would
let's
be
do
bored
it.
to
Let's
fucking
talk-
death.
Call
about it,
back
but-
next time J
but,
Mike's
well,
on
maybe
and talk
Discord
about
or
these
something
people.
like that. We can because there's a lot more I want to learn about that.
But we've been going for about 18 minutes, Joshua, and frankly, I think the thing that is bothering, I know it's bothering them the most, the thing that bothers me the most as well about it always boils down to this with the fine-tuning argument, is it's not just it was designed, it was designed this way for this reason by this guy from this version of this translation of this holy book and it's always so much more, and like just you're baking all that into the sauce when you really don't need to do so, especially considering the fact that you haven't even given a good reason to believe the very beginning of your premise. So you're just building this huge pyramid of bullshit on top of already very shaky ground, and I don't know how you can be comfortable doing that, but I hope you call us back and tell us more about it, Joshua, all right?
Joshua, sorry for being a little hostile towards you. I
No,
think we could have a good conversation. I do.
Maybe so. Maybe so. Have a good day, Joshua.